lot of people have concerns on scope. Every portion of everything on the website, every email correspondence about scope seems to say it's not a big deal, there's nothing we can do about it, nothing in the current contract limits scope, they can still do it. However, if that's the case, then why did the company open it? Why do they want more flexibility?
Look, I mean, we clearly understand, everybody understands, the fear that the company has introduced because of their restructure. That was the reason we did these things, was to kind of put a actual piece of paper in your hand that you can say, all right, the union's dealing with my expectation on a career delay or expected career delay now. But the fear is extremely challenging to kind of overcome, especially when we're dealing with ratifying a tentative agreement. And there's been some speculation out there about what the company could do under the current language versus what they can do today. But what you asked specifically was, well, why would they want to do what they did in scope? And we saw this consistently in everything they did. In every single section they opened, they had one key driver, and that was to save every single penny. As small and as minor as it was, they wanted to pick up every nickel because they knew they were on the hook, and we came in clear of what the contract goal was, and that was retirement. And they had a pretty good expectation of what that was going to look like based off of our 2018 discussion. So they went out of their way, and that's why we had such a hard time in the back and forth at the table. We literally fought for weeks over per diem, and we were fighting, and the initial numbers, it was staggering to us how much they were fighting. And Rich mentioned how much we went after trying to get just a State Department attachment on our per diem. Ultimately, we got 2. But that's because every penny is exceptionally important to them today, now in light of all their balance sheet savings that they're trying to put in place. What they saw was in the scope language an ability to save some money. And the penalty calculation saves them some money, the way that it's calculated now. What it does for all of us, for every pilot now, there's not a pilot in this room, including some of us up here at this table, that can take the current penalty structure and go on your own and go calculate a penalty. You can't get your way through that language. It's nearly impossible. When the company sends over the report that's required to actually pay a penalty, there's a lot of back and forth and checks that go on the Excel spreadsheets, and oftentimes we find mistakes in that. So what it does do for us is it simplifies the process. In fact, it makes it much easier on the way out of this to actually see where the wet lease is, and you can be the judge of, hey, are they wet leasing more? Does it seem like they're wet leasing more or not? And then it's far easier in future negotiations to say, we think you're leaning on wet lease too heavily. We don't see you growing the airline. So how do you address that? There's 2 pieces in that formula now that you address. You have block hours, and you have the actual SPR, the actual penalty. So you can ratchet down the percentage that they can fly. So right now, 1% is penalty-free, depending on if they're adding airplanes or not. So it's easy for us to say, you know what, 1% was too much. We're going to bring that down to 0.5 or 0.25%. That will be free. On the other side of that equation is you increase the SPR. You increase and make it really painful for them. The thing is, the penalty payment has never and will never stop this company from wet leasing. In fact, we don't want it to, because what they've done throughout their history is they've made consistent decisions there with their levers. And they have 3 levers to move when the economics change and the business opportunities change. The first lever is aircraft acquisition. The second lever is pilot staffing, and the third lever is wet lease. That's how this company expands and contracts to meet the demand in the market. We cannot be a static company. We cannot have hard and fast. We don't want to tie the company's hands. We don't want to limit their ability to do that, because guess what? All that comes back to us, and we have a less efficient company, a company that can't make margins, a company that gets targeted, and a company that's non-competitive, and then we're all out of a job. And that's what we have to balance here. The most important thing we can do in scope is always ensure and protect pilots' jobs. It's not the wet lease penalty. We know this because if you take every wet lease penalty going back to 2006, that amounts to $6,300 per pilot on average going back to 2006 with the payments that have been made to the association. That amounts to $345 on average for every pilot going back to 2005. If you take out their largest aberration, the most recent scope penalty payment, that amounts to $134 per pilot going back to 2005. That's the totality of those payments. So what was more important to us? That doesn't move the needle on a Starbucks for the rest of the year. So what was more important to us? Was it that penalty payment and giving the company a break on that and saying, yeah, we recognize this contract is going to cost you an excessive amount of money. We're willing to give you a break here because the pilot jobs was far more important to us. And what did we do? We had no idea that the company's volumes were going to drop off. None. But we said, let's plan on a worst case scenario. What do we know to be true? And what we know to be true is that when volumes drop off, wet leasing dries up, wet leasing slows down, wet leasing stops. We only need to look out at the ramp and you can see the Atlas contract finished. You know that we're not going into this peak without or with wet lease. Done. And why is that? Because it's an additive cost to the corporation. Why would you wet lease an airplane when you already have 400 aircraft worth $28 billion in equipment and other costs sitting on the ramp that can be flown today by FedEx pilots that aren't going full? Why would you bring in layer in one more additional cost? It makes zero business sense to do that. Zero. So I'll finish by saying the wet lease isn't the problem. The volume right now is the problem. All you have to do is take a look at the company's earnings call transcript, and you can see where our volumes are at. And FedEx has to get this business back in shape. We have to get our bottom line back in order. They're cutting out every potential expense, excessive and unnecessary expense, to make this company more efficient to deal with the competition. So that's what this is all about. So we don't ever think that scope isn't a big deal. We think it's a huge deal. And we didn't say there's nothing we can do about it. What we said was we acknowledge the language in there today, and the language is supported by those penalty payments, that when they exceeded those limits, that a penalty was incurred and in fact paid to us. Over the past 2 decades, it has been on 5 separate occasions.
You have to evaluate the meaning of may and shall or shall not in light of the context in which they're used. That's standard interpretive principles. And the shall not that you are referring to is tied to what is known as a liquidated damages clause. So violation of the shall not in the old contract as was put out has a established penalty. Any arbitrator who looks at that is going to say that's your remedy. There's a shall not in the new agreement, which says the company shall not extend, renew, or enter into any new Section 1B6 wet lease during a period in which 4A2C is implemented. That has no liquidated damages clause to it. So that means they can't do it. If we go to arbitration, we're entitled to a make-whole remedy and a cease and desist.
My first question, a 2-part question with that. I saw there's a 3-year vesting schedule. I was hoping you could elaborate onto that as far as when that 3-year starts, whether that starts already for those of us who have already been on property, or it starts February 1st, 2025, or wherever that is, and if that's a cliff or if that's a prorated 3 years. And the second part of that question is, obviously we're looking at 11%, no cash over cap on that, but is cash over cap something that can be potentially negotiated in the future, or does it need to just be a higher percentage, 12 or 13, so on and so forth?
And thanks for the question. Yeah, let's start with a 3-year vesting schedule. That vesting starts when you are brought in as a new hire, and I think it begins from day one, though you have to sit out 1 month before you could actually accrue a benefit, unlike the pension plan where you have a whole year before you actually start to accrue your benefit. The vesting schedule is similar to the pension plan where it requires 1,000 hours. However, all you got to do to get those 1,000 hours is if you can inhale and exhale and make a mirror fog up, you have accomplished your goal. And you're going to get a credit. This is a government fix. That's not a fix. It's a government alternative under plan language that allows a company to either use actual hours or an equivalency. And so the equivalency is that you get 95 hours every pay period. Remember, the plan starts in June. It takes about 6.5 months to go ahead and get those 1,000 hours. So that vesting schedule, to answer your question, starts immediately. And the difference is in the pension plan, it's 5 years to get fully vested. In this plan, it's a hybrid plan, still defined benefit, it's only 3. So it's actually less to get fully vested than what it would be in the pension. You had a second part to the question?
Yeah, going down in the future, is it going to be a better or easier or more appropriate for the company to try to negotiate a higher percentage besides 11, or instead keep it at 11, go for a cash over cap, if that's even a thing for that type of plan?
Yeah, our view is deferred benefits are deferred benefits. They offer protections for all sorts of things, including taxes, bankruptcies, and other things, that gross tax deferred. The reason other airlines have gone with cash over is that they've had no other alternative. Those plans were born of bankruptcy. Its defined contribution solution is what was available to them, and the only avenue they had was cash. We do have other options, and that money that would otherwise perhaps be run over the top into cash, we can go ahead and run that into the defined benefit plan, and we don't need to have cash over cap.
Question on the current legacy A plan. What was the company's per pilot funding obligation for that? And how does that compare to an 11% contribution that the new plan has?
So you're looking for the equivalency?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a little bit of NDA issues. So I don't want to just go blathering out things that until, that's a check with your lawyer question. But I can tell you this, it is, at some point, things equal out, let's put it that way. The company puts money in, it grows at a certain percentage, and it makes the benefit. We're doing the same thing here. Our benefit under this plan over periods of time is greater than what the company would accrue over an equal time period, right? We're talking 25 years. So the short answer is there is more money going into this plan than their obligation is to us, especially under the old cap.
I'm looking for a little more information about the market-based cash balance plan. So currently, if I go to 65, my retirement year will be 2055. I was fortunate to be hired young, and I know that's a long way off. But Captain Chris, I believe you were hired about the same age that I was. I was doing a little math. I believe you're 35 years on property, or close to it.
34 years on property.
Okay, so 34, and I'm correct. I'm exactly in the same shoes that you are, and hope to be sitting there one day as well. So I am not an expert in this by any means, but what is the rate of return on this plan? And you guys have like 6.5%. We can play with the modeler. My question really is about the floor of the plan. You also use a lot of the numbers based on the IRS limit, 330, how it can go up. But if somebody was to say an FO for an extended period of time, I've been playing with some numbers. Let's just say an average salary of $250,000 a year. 11% of that's $27,500. So if you put those numbers in, $27,500, 30 years, it's about a little over $800,000. That's with 0%. Is that the floor? So my question is, can it go below that? Are your gains locked in at any point? Basically, 30 years from now, how am I supposed to know or plan how much money I will have available?
Yeah. All right, let's start with the 6%. That 6% is a number that we needed to have to show everyone here what this plan should probably do over a long period of time. It is not a lock-in. The company is not going to subsidize it. It's a market-based plan. Just like our DC, the numbers go up, the numbers go down. They think they could support a 6.5%. They were willing to stand behind that. We thought that was a reasonable number. That's the number to use. Will that be what you have? at least that. Let's put it that way. It should, that number is supportable. So if we're using that in the calculations, it's a reasonable number. So the other part is the 11%. As this is a defined benefit plan, there has to be something that is defined. And that is that 11% contribution all the way up to the last day you get one. So from the first to the last, every one of those contributions made by the company is something they owe you. So if they go negative, and for you, they'd have to go negative for a long time. I'd be watching some other things if that happens. That's a long time. But theoretically, let's say it happened. They owe you all those contributions at 11% as a benefit. That's a floor. It's something that does not exist on the defined contribution side. And there was one more part?
Let me just hypothetically just play this scenario and understand to move to the next question, please. So let's say that I am in year 2054, and I'm not exactly sure, but if I compound that interest at 6%, I'm looking at $2.5 million in this defined benefit plan. Year 2054 comes around, I'm submitting my 12-month advance retirement notice, and we go into a worldwide depression. This account, this fund absolutely takes a nosedive. Where is the floor of my $2.5 million? Does it go back down to just the 11%, which is a net of $800,000?
They owe you, as a defined benefit plan, they owe you that 11%
with zero gains. With zero gains.
With zero gains. That's the answer to your hypothetical question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, that's clarification. Thank you.
Why would the company spend negotiation capital on opening up the scope section if they don't intend to exploit the new language? That's going to be based on block hours, not credit hours as it was in the current language.
So I'm pretty sure we didn't say wet leasing was cheaper and more efficient. I'm pretty sure we said that wet leasing costs twice as much and is 20% less reliable. You are putting words in our mouth. You are taking for granted things that are not true. We actually have a limit in this TA that says that if they enter 4A2C, they have to stop. We have shown you how in the current language, if they enter into a long-term lease, they may never make a penalty payment. Never make a penalty payment. So how is that protecting jobs, Brian? More than an actual limit that we've put into this TA.
Does the company agree that when we go into furlough that we're still in 4A2C?
That's the company's position right now.
That they are or are not?
That they are still in 4A2C.
Okay, so they cannot furlough.
They cannot wet lease.
Okay.
Until they come out of 4A2C, which would be when we're on the upswing.
So the 7,000 hours they can wet lease penalty-free for now.
What's the limit for them now?
None without penalty until you get your 2 and 4.
Okay, so now, under the current language, the company can wet lease as much as they want with a penalty. We've already determined that the wet lease on its own costs twice as much and is 20% less reliable, at least 20% less reliable. Now I'm going to ask you, what company is going to make the choice, if they don't have to have it, to pay twice as much, plus the cost of the pilots that they already have, for less reliability and a brand that's built on absolutely guaranteed it's going to be there on time? How does that make any sense?
I got emails. What do you think of this scope thing? We're giving away everything. It's dangerous. We're going to outsource the whole company. I said, I don't know. I got stuff on my plate. I got till the end of July to figure this out. On my last deadhead, I read, had a cup of coffee, crossed my legs in my first class seat. It wasn't lie flat. And I read every line by line. I read the deletions. I read the blueprint. And I felt stupid because I don't get it. I'm like, where is this poison pill? I saw a condition where it was probably under some things you could contrive where the company would, pay less money. I also saw that if they did a wholesale wet lease, they'd pay a lot more, hence the $1,000 threshold. And I thought, well, it's a negotiating committee, not a taking committee. Like fishing isn't catching. Now here's the deal. What I understood, and I want to make sure I'm correct, and this is actually my question, and I want to clarify it. What I understood is right now, there are wet leases a company can get into all the time without payment. And those are flights that have not been traditional FedEx flights within 2 bid packs. So if it's a new route between Nairobi and Madagascar, they can fly the daylights out of that, and we don't get a dime. That's my first question. Is that true? The second thing is, the penalties that exist now, sorry, I'm not an opera singer. The penalties that exist now vary to as low as the average pay for a crew complement, which could be just a first officer and a captain, to the furlough penalty that was the max rate of pay for a captain, a first officer, and an RFO. My understanding is that in exchange for that 1,000-hour, notional 1,000-hour, but that 1% to 1.25% threshold they have to meet, so they get that for free. In exchange for that, any penalty applied goes to the max rate for a 3-man crew and not a 2 average. And that in addition, that is compared against total block hours. Do those total block hours include stuff that wasn't traditional FedEx flying, like Morningstar, or is that stuff excluded?
The Morningstar Canada flying is excluded from that.
Okay, but my assertion that the penalty went from a low of an average of a 2-man crew per 2-person crew
On that calculation.
to the max for a 3-person crew every time, that's SPF. And then if they furlough and we're coming out of furlough, not only do they have to pay for the wet lease during that time, but then they also have to pay 2.5 times that penalty for every wet lease.
Yeah, it's a 1x penalty to the furloughed pilot themselves, and if
Right.
you happen to be the only furloughed pilot, you're going to be the wealthiest furloughed pilot in the
And the reason we went to,
airline industry.
well, the reason you guys chose block hours is because that's hard data that can't be fudged. And you get that for, they're not going to, if they do Honolulu to, or Memphis, you're looking at hard block hours instead of duty washout and all that stuff, and it's quantifiable. So you can hold their feet to the fire?
That's all correct.
So I read it line for line and I understand it?
You understand it very well.
All right, thanks, gentlemen.
Yep.
I want to thank you guys for all your tireless efforts. And as this process has been going on, I've gone back to ask myself the question which led me to FedEx, why I came here: job security and pension. I'm a career military guy. I understand pensions. It drew me to FedEx. Things that concern me with this is why did the company open scope if it wasn't advantageous for them? I get it. I'm beating the dead horse here. It's been asked a lot. I'm just trying to get more clarity on it. And who's to say that FedEx can't contract Atlas for more than a year? Right now, volumes are down. Today, there's 90 FOs on reserve on the MD-11, including me. That scares me.
So they actually did contract longer on Atlas that just finished up. And the reason they had to do that, so the company prefers monthly or quarterly wet leases. They, do not want to lock themselves onto the coattails of another airline and the brand X that are out there. And again, Atlas, their metrics aren't up to par with FedEx. We have a global brand that the company protects dearly, and their global brand comes with a commitment to high-value B2B customers, as well as obviously the consumer, but they guarantee delivery. They guarantee it with real cash, unlike the passenger airlines, and that's why FedEx takes the scope portion of their contract very differently, and they manage that differently. So why can't they? They can. They can have long-term contract, but they don't like the long-term contract because There's depreciation issues for them, and then there's also locking in an added cost to the company. The ACMI, I think a lot of pilots think about this ACMI thing as just the C, just the crew part. It's aircraft, crew, maintenance, and insurance. So they're paying that to Atlas. They're paying that to anybody that can carry our freight when the demand requires it. So when they pay that, they're not just paying just enough for the crew members to get paid, they're paying Atlas ACMI to make a profit. And their profit margin on top of what they're paying, of what FedEx has to pay them, 10% at least for these ACMI operators to actually earn a profit. They can't go in and say it's for free, you just pay for everything here. So they're in a business model themselves that demand a profit margin for their existence. FedEx is willing to pay it, willing to pay a premium, but right now the situation you're describing is exactly the situation that this new language protects you from. That's declining volumes, decreasing volumes. If our airplanes aren't full, why would they go and put 5 or 6 more airplanes on the ramp that they also can't fill up at added cost? It makes no sense at all from a business perspective to be efficient there. When we talk about the reduction, I don't know if it was Brian or you, somebody mentioned that I said 500 to 1,000 pilots overstaffed. Company doesn't share the staffing formula with us. It's not in the contract. We believe, if you look at the count of new hires in the past year, they're clearly overstaffed. And what we're saying is this TA helps fix staffing immediately for all the pilots at the bottom of the demographic. All the pilots who see potential job loss or stagnation, the exact thing that will help you to turn this thing around would be for a lot of these pilots to go and retire and walk off. Thank you for the long career. Make way for us, right? I mean, it's time for some folks to retire here and do it in dignity and do it with the benefit that we've worked our tail off to give them, to negotiate for them. And that will make everybody's life a little bit better here when the staffing gets right-sized. And FedEx is doing everything they can. And so we also have a couple other issues out there. The United States Postal Service contract. The company, again, I'm not saying anything I can't disclose. Just read the quarterly earnings. They mentioned that as a threat. It's a headwind right now. It's a headwind that they're projecting because they have to go back in and renegotiate the Postal Service contract. And what is the Postal Service CEO doing? Postal Service has them on a 10-year, very similar restructure over there. They're saying flying less, trucking more. Sounds familiar. So the Postal Service is trying to get their money-losing quasi-government agency into a money-winning situation. Good luck. And then FedEx, who actually has a fighting chance of that, is saying that's a threat, that's a headwind. But we're also seeing some opportunity. The opportunity is well known right now in the industry. The opportunity has to do with our brothers and sisters at UPS. And I hope they don't go on strike. But FedEx is absolutely sending and deploying their international and domestic sales teams into all corners of the globe to go welcome one-on-one those customers. Because you know what? It's good for us, and it's good for our business. And I hope they're aggressive with it. I hope we get some of those UPS customers and turn them into long-term customers. Because at the end of the day, it may offset some loss in freight, or it may actually turn this thing around for us. So the best way to fix this thing is to actually get this company healthy, let them do their job. We don't run the company. We fly airplanes from point A to point B safely. CEOs are making decisions about integrating the biggest air network with the biggest ground network on the globe right now that competes with only UPS and DHL. And they're trying to do it in a way without disrupting or dismantling what they've already built. And the biggest thing in that is their name brand. They don't want to lose that in the process. So they have a very tricky, a very challenging thing at their fingertips that they're trying to manage through that isn't happening today, it isn't happening tomorrow, it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years. You just need to look at the TNT integration and see how long that went. So they have an enormous job. And the sooner and quicker they can put us on a better glide path to financial improvement, the better off we all are. And I think we have to be aware of the opportunity that FedEx has out there. But will they be making this more of an express division in terms of what we used to fly, which is P1 freight, and pushing off 2- and 3-day deferred freight to maybe a truck. If they can truck it from Boston to Newark, and it's 2 or 3 day, and they can make room on our 757 for P1 freight, on the international, can they push off what they call dirty freight? Stuff that goes in the bellies is called dirty freight because it has 0 to no yield. In fact, sometimes it costs this company money to move that freight because they're protecting a larger, bigger, broader base of customers out there that have different demands within our network system. Sometimes they need it there immediately, time definite. Sometimes they don't care if it gets there, but it has to get there 2 days later, but not by a specific time. So they have to balance this whole network as well.
Something that hasn't been mentioned, and it does tie into the scope wet leasing, is 4A2B and 4A2C. One of the changes in this TA was to change how we calculate the SAM, and they've eliminated secondary lines. The reason we did that is because we have no access to looking at what the secondary lines is. What Rich said, he said some of these lines add carry-in, vacation, mill leave, and it drops the value of those secondary lines down quite a bit, dropping what the SAM is. At the beginning of the year, this was my #1 focus, to figure out how to keep us out of 4A2B and keep us out from hitting that trigger of 68 on the SAM. Now, I'll correct Rich, sorry Rich, but every month, January, February, March, April, the secondary lines included in the SAM drove the SAM down 2 to 2.5 credit hours. The SAM last month was, the regular line SAM was 70 and change. And if we included the current CBA definition of the SAM, we would be entering into 4A2B in the next month or two. So I think part of that is we get prelims for August today, and for the past 2 months, we've maintained right at 70, and I think they said this August is looking like a repeat of the past 5 months, so it looks like this is the first 3-month stretch where we're gonna hit a baseline of about 70. I can't predict where the economy's going. A lot of our business is driven by the economy, but hopefully this is where we'll start bottoming out. So, but the redefinition of the SAM definitely helps us keep us out of 4A2B and hopefully completely out of 4A2C. And last thing is, this is about my 3rd cycle of up and down. It takes a while for the company to catch up. Hiring, training, all that takes time. But I've seen it happen before. We didn't know we were overstaffed, and then we're like, oh my God, we're overstaffed. And it's the same thing with being understaffed. The economy takes off next year or 25, we'll be in the same boat catching up on the upswing. I've seen it happen 3 times here over my 27-year career. So, but welcome aboard anyway.
So me and the 500 or 600 of my new friends that have been hired shouldn't be concerned?
There's always concern. I am the Chicken Little of the union. I always go to the MEC saying, sky's falling. We need to do this to get ahead of it. We'll do the best we can, but what I'm saying is what's in this TA will help us keep us out of 4A2B and subsequent 4A2C.
Can the company wet lease and the wet lease cause the furlough? That's one of the concerns. We talked about once people are furloughed, they can't enter a new wet lease. That's a restriction. I think one of the concerns is entering into a wet lease that causes the furlough. And then, as Mr. Luby was mentioning, as far as the language of the contract, since if you go to mediation or somebody, it defines the penalty. As the penalty is defined, it almost makes it seem like if the company did an error, like they over wet leased due to the amount of additions or subtractions. If they did it on a massive scale, it almost seems like they would be breaking with the intent of the penalty, and that would be a different, I don't know.
Can the wet lease cause a furlough, I believe was the question.
I wanted to mention one thing about the wet leasing, and then Pat or Art can answer about the furloughing, is that the plan right now is to use our own airplanes instead of wet leasing for the near future. So, over to you, Pat.
Art?
Yeah, on the question that you referred to, look, the interpretive history of that is pretty clear. If you have if you violate a restriction and the penalty is written into the contract, then you are limited to the penalty. Now, if there was a mass wet leasing under either I think you'd still be limited to the penalty unless you could come before a court or an arbitrator and say that this was done in bad faith to undermine the union, and you can do that under either contract. So, you know, the only reason to have that language in there is to define the penalty. Under the new contract, if you did a mass wet leasing, which would have to be done piecemeal because there's not enough available lift right now that you could automatically do all of that, at that point, you would run into the restriction on having more wet leases. Once you did the first wet lease, at that point, you're protected against any furlough. So the new contract works on that scenario far better.
But my question is really about the market plan right now. So let's say under the legacy plan, it becomes, the company becomes financially distressed. This is hypothetical. And then subsequently, the legacy defined benefit plan becomes distressed, and this would require the PBGC to step in as an insurer. And we know that some folks live through that, and it's really kind of a crap deal. But assuming the market-based plan is fully vested, under the market-based plan, if it becomes distressed, and is it the same process with the PGBC, and are there any differences or guarantees, such as is the principal at least guaranteed? So that's part one. I got another part to the plan.
Yeah, I think this is pretty easy. I got Kathy here as backup, but the PBGC does insure both plans. The legacy plan is more at risk. The greater the benefit into the legacy plan, the more risk for us. The reason the more risk is that there's more volatility in that plan. There's more moving parts. There's interest rate parts, rates of return parts, mortality parts, things of that nature, and then of course there's always unknowns. With the cash balance plan, I think your intuition is correct. The company is on the hook for the 11% contribution credits that we discussed, right? However, because it is a defined benefit plan, and I gotta be careful here, I'm gonna say this is really going on if it ever should get to this point. So we're gonna talk real hypothetical. Yeah, real hypothetical here. Just like the legacy plan, the PBGC will look at the assets in the plan, see what benefits it could pay. It has a benefit schedule, and then it would make up out of its back pocket, exceptionally reluctantly, I might add, to go ahead and make those minimum payments under their PBG schedule. Now here's the thing. In this plan, assets and liabilities pretty much match up. They give you 11%, they owe you 11%, and all they have to do is get zero. That's their mark. All they got to do is not lose money. And if they do lose money, this gets reconciled really at your retirement as far as what they owe you. But as far as plan underfunding, you could see how hard it would be for them to get to the underfunding level. You got to go through 80%, get that threshold, go through 60%, and then they still have time to get back. They would have to not be able as a company to make up those kind of losses. And the reason that we're talking 6.5% going forward is because this is a very conservative portfolio, professionally managed by the people who have responsibly managed the pension all these years throughout some very turbulent times. So first, the structure of this plan makes it resistant, exceptionally resistant to a distress termination, especially when compared to our legacy plan, if that gives you any help.
Yeah, so basically it's the worst case we see right now, if everything went to crap hypothetically, bankruptcy, distress, and the PBGC folks come in, we're looking at, would it protect our principal of 330? I mean, assuming we maxed it out, and assuming the IRS did not raise it?
Okay, so are you saying, remember, it's a DB plan, so it will, the company is due to owes you that.
Correct.
Okay, the PBGC doesn't. The PBGC owes you the PBGC minimum, and then everything else that's over and above that minimum gets distributed on a schedule. Kathy, how am I doing?
You're doing great.
Okay.
Is this on? I'm Kathy Powers. I'm a benefits attorney at ALPA. And just to address your question about the market-based cash balance plan, actually, with respect to any defined benefit plan, if FedEx, in the unlikely situation, would go into bankruptcy.
Yes.
And would like to terminate the plan, or the
Yes.
PBGC
I don't trust our board
is
members, so
watching
yes.
the plan. The PBGC will not take over the plan if the plan is a collectively bargained plan. That is written in the law. So there would have to be negotiations with ALPA, and ALPA would have to agree to the termination of the legacy plan as well as the market-based cash balance plan. It's highly unlikely that the PBGC would attempt to terminate the market-based cash balance plan because it's unlikely that it's going to be underfunded. It's designed so that it will always be fully funded, and that's the difference between the market-based cash balance plan and a legacy defined benefit plan. With a legacy defined benefit plan, the funding is very volatile. It depends on complicated funding rules that are in the IRS regulations, and so if there was a choice, I mean, again, this is all hypothetical.
Sure. Well, I'm trying to find the edges.
Right. If a plan has to be terminated in order for FedEx to survive bankruptcy, and that is the standard for a distressed termination, the corporation cannot emerge from bankruptcy, would have to liquidate unless the plan is terminated. I mean, the plan that will be terminated is the legacy plan. It's a very hard standard to meet today. There were a lot of funding rules that changed because of the bankruptcy era, and so, I guess I'm trying to give you assurance that the market-based cash balance plan will not be the plan that would be terminated in order for FedEx to survive bankruptcy.
All right, and real quick, part two, same type thing, is under the IRS limits of $330,000 today, assuming that does not change, the market-based plan would only accept principal payment up to $330,000 for the life of the market plan. Is that a true statement?
Could you say it one more time?
If the IRS limits don't change.
If the IRS limits don't change, would the market-based plan only accept the principal up to that limit?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So it's based on what they pay you,
Okay,
right?
so
11%.
Right. So if the total value of the individual notional account exceeds $330,000, but the total principal payments were less, say $300,000, would the company then continue the 11% even though the value is above the $330,000?
What, Rick?
I think you're misinterpreting the 330.
Okay, maybe.
The
That's kind of one of the questions here.
The 330 is the maximum amount of your compensation that the 11% will be paid on. It's not a principal amount in the account. I think that's what you're.
Yeah. So then I totally misunderstood the plan.
So the $330,000 is the first $330,000 that you make.
Right.
Every year, FedEx will put 11% of that amount into the cash balance plan. That 330 amount goes up with inflation. So as that climbs, like it was 305 last year, it was 290 the year before that. So as that goes up, then you will get more of your paycheck that will get that 11% put into the plan.
Kind of like a 417. Like
So there's no principal cap. It's a cap on the amount of compensation credits that you get each year.
Per year.
Yes.
Per year.
Okay, that answers. Thank you.
To start off with, I want to thank Pat and all you guys. I know no matter what your personal opinions are of this TA, that you guys have worked your butts off for the last 2 years and put a lot of time and effort into that. So I do thank you guys for doing that because I sure didn't want to do it. But that being said, I now have a question/ask of you. So you said a couple times that the company's position currently, and that's the verbiage you use, which is what's concerning to me, is that furloughs are considered to be a continuation of 4A2C. However, in 1B10, that is not, the word furlough is not in that section at all. Will you commit to getting a side letter written before voting opens, confirming that position from the company, and is that a possibility? Because otherwise, I'm afraid it'll end up being like the lay flat business seat from the last contract where we think we have something and then we find out later that they decided to reinterpret it.
Yes, I just want to point out, appreciate the question, but I do want to point out that there is an entire section that's furlough and recall, it's section 23. In section 23, the first paragraph is A1 furlough. And in A1 furlough, there's also A1A, which says no furlough shall occur prior to the application of 4A, 2B, and 2C. So that handles the process. So you can't skip over those two and go straight to the furlough. So in the plain language, that's clear, it says it. So then if we follow kind of the path down the 4A, 2B, 4A, 2C language, and when we say how would the company proceed in that manner, you really have to dig into both of those paragraphs, and you realize that from an operational standpoint, there's a lot of handcuffs that get put on the company. Just one of those, to begin with, is 85% of all the lines system-wide need to be constructed so that the lines are no more than 13 credit hours apart. And we have a significant difference today in our existing fleet between the 777 and the 757 that makes that nearly impossible. The other thing, if you continue to read in there, and you process again down 4A2C, it also says that the company will publish a system bid to rebalance staffing among the crew position in the company's fleets. So that's another requirement within 4A2C, that the company has to do that. There's not an optional. So
correct,
the
but
training
none of
bid,
that directly ties furlough as a separate or same step as 4A2C. There is nothing that I've been able to find so far that handcuffs or directly relates those two things. It could just as easily be misconstrued that there's 4A2B, 4A2C, and now furlough. And their opinion now is that 4A2C and furlough are the same or a continuation, but there's nothing that is a hard definition saying that the two are tied together, especially in the protection against furloughing or wet leasing during furloughs.
okay.
I don't want to, I guess what I'm saying is not give the company the option to work around it because we have to dig for it.
Yeah, I think, I'm pretty sure I understand the question.
Yes, I think the answer to your question was in the 2015 TA, when we incorporated the 0902 and 0904, correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, when we bargained the 4A2B and now the 4A2C, the company, there's a letter that was in the 2015 TA that was published, and the company's position was, if they are in 4A2C, they can furlough.
Right.
So you can still, the company's position is you can still be in 4A2C with the minimum bid period guarantee lowered and still furlough.
But is that letter still in force under a new TA? Or a new
Yes,
TA?
it's just that any letter or letter of agreement that was part of the 2015 or 2006 or the 1999 agreement, that just continues on. That is the company's formal position.
The last thing I want to point out in the scope section, hopefully, is paragraph D3. So when we talk about the scenario that I've heard out there where they go and they basically assume all of this wet lease from an operator or multiple operators, and they just gobble everything that's up there, because what you're saying is they're trying to replace 400 aircraft, mostly wide-body fleet, with whatever wet lease lessors are out there. But if you go to paragraph D3 in the scope section, D3 states, should the company acquire, merge, or operate another U.S. certificated airline or U.S. certificated air operator that employs pilots who operate aircraft with a max takeoff gross weight of greater than 60,000 pounds, then such pilots operating the aircraft above 60,000 pounds max takeoff gross weight scheduled to be retained, if any, shall be integrated into the FedEx master seniority list. So hopefully that handles we're going to go and get every wet lease that's out there from a single company. If they do it, then paragraph 3 applies there, and they have to be added into our master seniority list. Therefore, they're back in the same situation they were before they started. Thanks.
Looking at the comparisons on the ALPA website for the calculator, I rolled over from my previous legacy employer. I'm assuming that goes into my, where I can input my balance, and then whatever so far FedEx has put in, I put that in. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I told you it was fast.
Okay. We like those questions.
The 1B4 section. the extra, outside the 48 that can be flown by anyone, anytime, belly freight, whatnot, has that little hidden clause in the middle, domestic, quote, except when economically necessary. The little side letter that's attached to this one that's saying we're not going to talk about it unless you give us specific package tracking number examples. How does that, how does that kind of coalesce or come together?
Yeah, so part of when we talked to you about how we went in, and I can't remember now if it was 24 hours ago or this one, we explained when we came into the scope negotiation that the MEC directed us to, hey, let's see how much we can actually put back at them, and we did. We kind of threw the kitchen sink at them, hoping that we could certainly get a foot in the door on more job protections, but we had a realistic approach that, look, it's really hard to kind of gauge the magnitude or put a rule in place when you don't know the size of the problem. The same thing in particular comes up when you're trying to handle RCO, reduced cockpit operations, is how do you go and put a rule in place without really having a well-defined issue yet in front of us. And so part of that was to tell the company that they need to continue along their quarterly meetings with our scope committee and be able to explain, when asked, more detailed information, such as belly freight, interline code, load code, share, all those things. And it basically, they agreed that when they come in and the scope committee chair cites, because oftentimes we have on the receiving side of that, pilots will say, hey, I just saw a bunch of freight getting loaded onto, Atlas out in wherever. And we get that from the pilot, and then that comes through. Typically, our representation department gets funneled to Randy. Randy goes into the meeting and asks specifically about that question. So we wanted to really get a foothold in there and getting that information back from the company so we can start to get the first measures of what that is. That letter just simply formalized it, but it also said they're not going to go to any extra measures. They're not going to add a whole tracking, supporting staff to make these reports fundamentally available at our whim, is basically what the letter says. Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and it's just what Rich had said earlier. The 1B9 language is a very good positive that we were able to achieve, and it codified the ability of the scope chairman to ask about belly freight, in particular, specific things. And like Rich said, the lawyers were so concerned they had to write basically a letter that says in 200 or 300 words what it says in 1B9 now in 4 words. That basically said it's a codification and a clarification that we can ask, because they were concerned that we would go in there and say, we want all the belly freight agreements from the past 6 months. And they were making very clear that we were asking about specific activities, and again, to get our foot in the door to start getting information.
But then doesn't that come to we have to find it?
Well, it's a codification and a clarification that we can go and ask about specific activities. But again, a foot in the door,
Gotcha.
A move forward.
Okay.
We asked for a report on all belly freight, and we stuck with that through the negotiations, but at the end we weren't able to accomplish that, so we got this language put in as a foot in the door to try to move the ball forward. And then the company felt the need, they were so worried about us getting that foot in the door that they felt the need to write that letter. The letter's not a restriction on anything that we have now. They're trying to limit what we got.
Gotcha. Okay.